It's 7 long years since Labor last tried to wind back tax breaks for property investors. Back in 2019, Bill Shorten took a raft of tax changes to the election, and it didn't go particularly well. Now, the Albanese government is tentatively dipping its toe back in the water. Treasury is looking at changes to both the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing rules in the lead-up to the May budget. As it happens, a Senate inquiry into the capital gains tax break, which was set up by the Greens and the Liberals, has been hearing from various experts this week. Those who want to keep the tax break as it is argue it's important to incentivise investment in housing. Those who want the tax break dumped or wound back say it's simply lining the pockets of property investors and locking out young workers from ever owning their own home. There are, of course, a range of things the government could do when it comes to these twin tax breaks, whether it's going to be something that applies retrospectively or prospectively, whether they're dumped or wound back. I'm keen to explore, though, what's really going to make a difference. I'm David Speers on Ngunnawal Country in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Bernie Fraser was Treasury Secretary back in 1985 when the Hawke Keating government first introduced capital gains tax. He went on to become Reserve Bank Governor for 7 years. Bernie Fraser, welcome.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you. Now, look, we'll come to capital gains tax, which is the issue you were giving evidence on at this Senate hearing during the week. But later in the week, we've learnt the government's also, or Treasury is also looking at negative gearing rules as well. Is this worth a look? Should negative gearing rules be changed?
Indeed, they should be looked at. And what part of the problem is, and I don't know where you want me to start, but my really starting point with this view of taxes and other changes that might and should be made to the housing market, I start with the position that for many years now, so many people, Australian people on workers and other people of modest means and young couples that dream of owning their own home and so on, they've gone along to housing markets and auctions, and those sort of meetings have really turned into being heartbreak centres because prices have gone up so much that these people on modest means and the young couples that are dreaming of owning their own house have seen those dreams blow up because the housing prices have gone up so much in the last 20 years. And one measure of that is that the increase in house prices over the last 20-odd years has been twice the rate of increase in average earnings. So there's an enormous gap there, and there are various factors that have contributed to that blowout in prices.
Well, indeed there are, and often we're told it's supply is the problem, not enough supply.
It's two things, but this is where I'm getting to the sort of tax, because the prices have gone up for two reasons, really. There's been an increase in the demand for houses, and there's been limited increase in the supply of housing. So you've got that the situation to produce big increases in prices, and that's been that's been happening. The question is, where's the increase in demand coming from? Well, people would say that some of it's coming from natural population growth and increases in immigration, and some would be coming from that. But I think a lot of the demand for housing that is contributing to the increase in prices is the very favourable taxation arrangements that surround investment in housing, and negative gearing was there as viewed as a way of encouraging investment in houses, and particularly rental housing. And then the capital gains tax was really to encourage investment or make people more incentivized in investing in housing. And they certainly did. They did that with spades, but it wasn't investing in houses, in the supply of houses. It was investing in houses as attractive investment opportunities, as wealth creation.
Pushing up the price.
That's where a large part of the increase in the prices come from. The favourable tax environment for wealthy people that want to invest in wealth-creating investments. And the tax environment is so attractive with the combination of the negative gearing and then coming along with the capital gains tax on top of that, the concession on top of that, and then the absence of any tax inheritance tax or wealth taxes makes investment in housing an extremely attractive thing to do if you're wealthy and you want to do
So
things.
I'll come to the capital gains tax, but on negative gearing, what the Treasury reportedly has been looking at is allowing people to negatively gear two investment properties, but after that, after your third, fourth, fifth, you can't negatively gear. Is that enough of a change here when we talk about negative gearing, or should it be something bigger than that?
Well, negative gearing, I think, was geared towards encouraging increased investment, particularly in rental housing, and that hasn't happened. You know, we've had negative gearing for some time now. It was put back in place after being knocked out by Paul Keating at one stage, and I was urging him to do so at that time, and he's never forgiven me for the criticism that he got for knocking it out and being forced to come back with it. But it hasn't really contributed anything to...
it hasn't helped the rental supply?
No. Well, we've still got shortages of rental accommodation everywhere, and we've had negative gearing in place, re-established for some years now.
So what would you do now? Would you remove it altogether, or do you think keeping some sort of negative gearing for one or two properties is okay?
I'm a bit reluctant to keep taxation arrangements there that are conducive to encouraging investment, increasing investment in housing by wealthy people who are pursuing it, not with the view of establishing more houses, but for making attractive investments for wealth purposes.
So get rid of negative gearing altogether?
Well, don't want to overclaim the changes that might be made, but I think that by making and you probably have to start, with new stuff, not
retrospective.
But anything that winds down the tax attractiveness of investing in housing by wealthy investors and thereby contributes to a reduction in the demand that's forcing up prices of housing because people are buying them for investment. The prices are going up, and it's the people on the low incomes and dreaming of owning a house but can't even, with the prices going up, they can't even afford to raise a deposit, let alone go out there and buy a house.
But if you're only stopping it for your third, fourth, fifth investment, that's not going to make a huge difference, is it?
No, that's why I think it's, if you're going to do these things, it's often to do them full-bloodedly, and that'd be, the people talk about cutting down the discount on capital gains from 50% to 25%, but that's still going to be part of an attractive tax environment for wealthy investors to continue to hammer housing as an investment opportunity, whereas all these other people that seek to have ownership of a house to live in, to raise a family in, even to die in, but to have something to provide security and other benefits for living and owning your own house. And that, I think, is something that I think Australians should have as a right rather than as a privilege.
So, Bernie Fraser, you're saying if the government's going to do something on both of these taxes, negative gearing and capital gains tax, do it properly. Don't just make a small change.
That's right, because there's a lot of talk about what can be done to change the current mess in housing. And the problems are too much demand in one sense, not enough supply. And there are all sorts of things being talked about that might be done to do these things, to take action on the demand side and the supply side, which is probably the main area to be looking at. And there might even be possibilities of using some tax measures on the supply side. But the main thing is...
Well, that's an interesting idea. What could you do? What could you do there?
Well, there are so many things talked about on the supply side, and the supply side is just doesn't not functioning very well at all. You know, look, it's just houses aren't being built for all sorts of reasons because there's not enough land, there's not enough labour, material prices are going up. All these things are there, and part of the problem, part of the solution to the current housing mix must focus a fair bit on the supply side. And on the demand side, it's my focus there is trying to remove the tax-driven attraction to wealthy investors to go into the housing market.
What about those who say, the opposition says, if you tax something more, you'll get less of it. So if you touch these tax breaks for investors, you're going to end up with less supply. They're not going to be investing in housing supply. What would you say to that?
But the people who get the benefit of the tax concessions, the negative gearing and the capital gains, that's not leading to any increase in the supply of housing. That's leading to the attractiveness of investing in housing by wealthy investors, and that's driving up the prices. It's contributing and extending the problem of prices going up, but supply not happening. And all sorts of ideas, including some crazy ones, are being talked about on the supply side. And do you cut back immigration, or do you concentrate on getting migrants to come in, or builders that can build houses? Where are you going to get more land to put the houses on? Suitable land, and there are all sorts of issues and questions for governments of all levels involved on the supply side.
And all of that. Just a bit of a history lesson here. You were there as Treasury Secretary when capital gains tax was first brought in. Very different, though, to what the Howard and Costello governments ultimately did to it at the end of the 1990s. Yeah. But back in the 80s, what was the thinking around bringing this tax in?
Well, I don't remember too much thinking about it at the time. When it came in with Howard and Costello in the end of 1999, it was viewed then as something to be done to encourage increased investment in housing. And that was partly driven by political considerations. Some politicians have, not every politician wants to see house prices reduced and be made more affordable to people, because many politicians, and this goes back to the Menzies days really, they see more votes in prices going up, houses going up, house prices going up, and Menzies used to talk about that way, and Howard has sort of echoed the same things. He's said, reported to have said, look, no one ever comes along to him and complains about their house prices going up. So all those people that have got houses are supportive of keeping them.
But this is the political conundrum, right? That was long the case. But do you think the politics maybe has now shifted to the point where there are so many younger Australians who cannot get into the market that flips the politics?
Well, I would hope it would, and it might I think that the hope that it will, that the Labor side of things might be persuaded to see the unfairness and the disadvantages that exist with the present tax-favoured area of investment in housing, which is forcing up prices, which is good for the investors and good for people like Bob Menzies and Howard, who see increases in prices of housing going up all the time as a way of keeping the votes there. But I think the hope is, or my hope is anyhow, that Labor is more concerned about the fairness and inequity of these arrangements that lead to wealthy investors doing okay, but at the expense of average income earners, young couples wanting to have their own house and develop grow their family up in it, but they're just priced out of the market. And this is something that, in my view, and which leads me to argue against the tax concessions and the tax incentive for people to force up prices to have more properties to invest. It should be a right for all Australians, including young people, people on average incomes, to have access to decent and affordable housing. But that's not there while there's, all these people out there, well, not all these people, but I think that most of the demand from the demand side in forcing up prices is from investors, because the other possible major source is population growth and migrants, and a lot of talk about immigration. But see, most immigrants if they do come out here, they're not the first thing they're not going to do is to go and buy a house. They come out and they rent houses, And I just think that it's unfortunate that there's not more appreciation of the concern for other people, other ordinary Australians, to be given a fair go, to have the right to pursue a ownership of a house to raise their family and to live in and so on. It shouldn't be a privilege of the wealthy people, but it is at the moment.
Away from these property tax breaks, keen to get your thoughts too on the debate around government spending. We are seeing government spending levels, as we keep being told, at their highest levels in 40 years, apart from the pandemic years. Is government spending too high, do you think? Is this part of the problem with inflation right now?
I don't believe it's a part of the problem with inflation. There is potentially a problem down the track if the spending goes on without appropriate funding. But I don't really see what's been done in terms of spending by Labor in the last couple of years as a significant contributor to inflation. I think that's just a story that the opposition is, just saying so many times that they're convincing themselves there's something in it, but I don't believe that it is, and most economists don't believe it is.
Are we moving, though, to an era where Australians want more from government and want that higher spending, a higher point of spending and taxation than historically we've had? Do you see that happening?
I think there are. It depends on what the spending would be on. I think there are a lot of people, as in other countries, in Australia, who would say, look, we'd be prepared to pay more taxes if that revenue goes to providing more housing, better health education and transport services. But they would, I think many of the people that might say that would balk when it comes to spending that extra money on defence, because someone in America says we got to spend more, and people in businesses in Australia want to develop all sorts of funny things, and it's what the spending is on. If the spending is on helping to reduce energy costs and provide better hospitals and education and so on, that's something to be applauded. I think it's part of making Australia a country for all Australians to live in, and housing has to be part of that. The Prime Minister, Albanese, has said many times that Australia is the best country in the world for people to live in. Well, it's not. You only have to look at housing and other problems at the present time, but it could be, but it needs a lot of things to be done that haven't been done.
Yeah, and just finally on that, coming back to the tax debate, there's pressure on the government, and there has been for a while, to do something ambitious when it comes to tax reform, not just change one tax here or one tax there, but to make a real change to deal with what it acknowledges is this intergenerational inequity, and housing's the big example of that right now. Is your advice to the government to use this moment to be ambitious, to do something bigger on tax reform?
Well, I've been concentrating on the housing sector, and that's been the main focus. There's always a case for looking at broader pictures of tax reform when you do it, and sometimes you can deal with problems in different sectors by having a broader approach to reform, and you pick things up, you give a bit away here and compensate in another place. But and that's why I think some people who might be attracted to the notion of reducing the attractiveness of investment in housing by wealthy investors by doing something in that area, but providing some compensation somewhere. And, the areas where in the housing sector there's a case for looking at cutting back on the tax attractions of investment in housing and doing something maybe on the tax side or other sides as well that helps to bring the supply up. But that's a big question. There's been a lot of talk about all these things, but we've really got, in my view, we've got to the point where there has to be action rather than talk. And a lot of things being talked about on the demand side and the supply side, but I think the first thing that should be clarified before people get hooked on particular approaches is to come to a clear understanding and of what's the basic purposes of housing. Is it there to provide an opportunity for Australians to acquire decent housing, to live in and raise their families in and enjoy the benefits of security and all the other benefits that come from owning your own house? Or is it there to provide incentives for wealthy people to invest, because that keeps those people supporting the party that supports house prices going up? And as I said, I get that viewpoint about more support, higher prices go up, the more votes we keep. That's the sort of Menzies Howard political view. I think that my disappointment about the measures that were raised a few years ago and then dropped completely after the election result, the shortened time. I think that was a pity because they gave up straight away. I thought those changes were worth persevering with and arguing and trying to get persuasion for later on. But because they got such a bad election result, and actually I think the subsequent analysis turned out to show that the disadvantage of the poor performance had more to do with making unfunded promises on the expenditure side rather than the tax changes. And I think always thought, well, it was a bit weak of them to give up on the tax changes, because I think they had something going for them. And despite that and the other things that are going on, I think that the Labor Party and others of that way of thinking on housing is the hope of getting some useful, necessary changes to this housing mess that we've got.
Well, we will see where they land over the coming weeks ahead of the May budget. Bernie Fraser, really good to hear your insights into all of this. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
All right, and thanks for your company as well. We'll have more on this Sunday morning. Hope you can join us for Insiders 9 a.m. on ABC TV.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.